Today, we're going to go deeper than just the crimes themselves. We're going to look at all the different ways the story of Jeffrey Dahmer was documented and really constructed. We'll explore how different people, from scientists to lawyers to his own father, all tried to create their own detailed documentary of a monster, each one piecing together a story to try and make some sense of the absolute horror. So, here's our roadmap. We're breaking this down into 5 totally distinct narratives. First up, the story that the evidence itself tells us, the forensic record. Then, we'll dive into the dueling stories that were built for the courtroom. From there, we'll get into the incredibly personal account from his dad, and then the clinical profile from the psychologists. And finally, we'll see how this whole thing got packaged, sold, and turned into a massive media franchise. Okay, let's start at the very beginning. The first story. This one wasn't told with words, but with cold, hard, physical evidence. This is the forensic record. Think about this. July 23rd, 1991. Investigators walk into Dahmer's apartment in Milwaukee, and right away, the scene itself starts to tell a story. They found the remains of 11 people. At this point, it's not a story about motive or psychology. It's just a raw, scientific story being told by bones, by tools, by the very apartment itself. The forensic team had a clear checklist, right? Figure out how these men died, try to figure out who they were, and document exactly what was done to them. But here's what's really fascinating. The evidence also started to build a timeline, one that suggested the killer's mental state was actually deteriorating. The increasing chaos in that apartment told its own silent, horrifying story of a downward spiral. All right, so you've got this objective story from the evidence, but how does that get translated into the very subjective world of a courtroom? This is where the goal changes completely. It's not about documenting anymore, it's all about persuading. So here's the absolute crux of the legal case. Dahmer confessed, and I mean, he really confessed. We're talking a 145-page document detailing everything. Now, you'd think that would make the trial a slam dunk, right? Nope. It actually did the exact opposite. It created this huge, complex challenge for both the prosecution and the defense. So what do you do with that? How do you take a document that damning and turn it into a winning argument? For both sides, the facts, what he did, were never really up for debate. The whole trial was about the story behind the facts, what was going on inside his head. And this quote just perfectly explains the corner the defense was backed into. They couldn't say he didn't do it. They couldn't argue with his own words. Their hands were completely tied, so their only move was to build their entire story within the framework that Dahmer himself provided. And that led to a very, very specific kind of legal fight. And here they are, the 2 completely different stories that were presented to the jury. On one side, you have the defense. They argued that Dahmer was a man so totally consumed by a mental disease, necrophilia, that he was literally powerless to stop it. But on the other side, the prosecution painted a picture of a calculating, sane killer. They brought in neighbors and coworkers who said, hey, he seemed perfectly normal to me. No delusions, no incoherence, just a regular guy. And in the end, everything boiled down to this one legal definition in Wisconsin. The jury didn't have to decide if Dahmer was mentally ill. Most people agreed he was. They had to decide if that illness meant he truly couldn't understand that what he was doing was wrong, or if he simply couldn't stop himself. That was the entire ballgame. Okay, let's shift gears now from the cold, formal courtroom to something deeply, deeply personal. After the trial, Dahmer's father, Lionel, set out to construct his own narrative, his own way of trying to understand the absolutely unimaginable. In his book, A Father's Story, Lionel Dahmer basically turns into a detective of his own past. He is obsessively searching for an answer, any answer. He goes all the way back to Jeffrey's birth, picking apart every memory, every moment, every potential red flag. He blames himself for being an emotionally distant father, and even wonders about some kind of monstrous inheritance passed down genetically. It is the ultimate heartbreaking documentary of a parent searching for an answer they know they'll probably never find. And you know, this LA Times review just nails it. The book isn't really a biography of a killer, it's more like an autobiography of a father's crushing guilt and grief. It's his story, a raw document of his own personal hell and his desperate need to understand how the little boy he raised could become that.
So, parallel to the father's emotional search, you have this very clinical, scientific one happening. And that brings us to the psychological narrative, the attempt by professionals to basically draw a map of the inside of Dahmer's mind.
What's so wild here is how systematic this whole process was. You have 8 different mental health experts interviewing him, all trying to build this coherent psychological history. One doctor, Judith Becker, created a developmental story for the defense, arguing that Dahmer had been consumed by this lifelong obsession. And that story was backed up by Dahmer's own unbelievably chilling accounts of his gruesome experiments to create zombies, which he claimed was an attempt to make his victims stay with him forever. So we've had the forensic story, the legal story, the father's story, and the psychological story. But it did not stop there. Not even close. All of these narratives became fuel for something else entirely, a cultural industry. The story of Jeffrey Dahmer became a product. I mean, just look at this list. It is relentless. For decades now, we've had a non-stop stream of books, movies, graphic novels, documentaries, you name it. Every single one is a new attempt to document, explain, or just retell the story for entertainment. From a young Jeremy Renner playing him in 2002, all the way to that massive Netflix series, the same story gets repackaged over and over for new audiences, turning a horrific real-life tragedy into its own true crime genre. And really, that's what it all comes down to. That's the final thought here. We have the scientific story, the legal one, the family story, the clinical story, and now they're all competing with dozens of TV shows and movies. So the real question isn't just who was Jeffrey Dahmer. The question is, which one of these stories do we, the audience, choose to watch and to believe? And maybe more importantly, what does our endless fascination with this kind of horror really say about us?